Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. I'm Tom, and this video is discussing Plato's Apology or Socrates Apology. This is a paper kind of talking about the importance or significance of philosophy, right? It's a kind of classic paper to go over. It goes back, it's pulled from kind of the ancient Greek era, right? So ancient Athens, 400 BC. And it's called Socrates Apology, or sometimes it's also called the Trial of Socrates. And it is actually recounting the actual trial of Socrates, where Socrates is actually put to death. It is written by Plato. Plato was a student of Socrates and wrote all his dialogues using kind of Socrates as his main character. However, this particular dialogue is one that is pretty historically accurate as far as we know, and he really is kind of just recounting what Socrates said at his actual trial. Now, Socrates, for some context, it's important to recognize that, Socrates was, not a philosophy professor, right? He had a very nomadic existence. The way in which philosophy looked in ancient Greece was much more like kind of like a cult or a religious spiritual movement, right? He had disciples, a group, that kind of followed him around. And Socrates in particular was very notorious for going around and asking people if they knew what some philosophical object was, right? And so he would want to know what the nature of beauty is, or what the nature of love was, or what the nature of knowledge was, or justice, or these kinds of things. And he would go to people who were very kind of regarded as experts in those areas, right? And he would ask them if they knew what those things were. And for example, he would go to a poet and ask them, well, what is beauty? You write things that are beautiful. What is beauty? And the poet would say, beauty is this. And Socrates would question that, and then they would kind of change their answer, and he would question that even more until eventually, the poet usually got frustrated, right? And he would do this with judges and ask them, what is justice, right? And he kept doing this to lots of important people until basically the people of Athens kind of got sick and tired of him doing this, right? And this is what leads him to his trial. And at this time, he's kind of in his 70s, and he's in the later stages of life. And he feels very vindicated in what he's been doing. And, his apology is really his defense for what he's been up to. And he thinks he's just kind of a truth seeker, right? He's just looking for some kind of truth. He's seeking wisdom, and he doesn't see anything bad about that at all. So he's brought up on 3 charges. And the first one is that he's making the weaker argument appear the stronger, right? The second one is corrupting the youth. And the third one is atheism, right? Or not believing in the gods, or being respectful to the gods, believing in different gods. It's a little bit, I think that third one is a little more murky than the first 2, right? And so I want to go through these in turn pretty quickly. But the thing that might strike one at this point is that these are kind of like odd charges to be brought up on, especially when the penalty is death. Right. But I think the best way to kind of motivate this is to look at how these charges have corresponding kind of contemporary versions of these, right? So making the weaker argument the stronger really looks very similar to making the false appear to be true, right? And this has various different ways in which it is illegal, right? So things like con artists, right? Fraud are cases where you kind of make some kind of business venture that's really a bad one appear to be a very good one, right? Also cases like defamation, libel, where one kind of twists the truth, makes something that is not really true appear to be very compelling in order to destroy someone's character or something like this. That is also kind of a legal offense, right? So there are versions of this in today's world, right? And that's kind of what they're accusing Socrates of doing, right? That he's kind of conjuring up these ideas that are not very good and kind of making them very compelling and twisting people around in his arguments. And what he claims is that his defense of this is to say that he really has no agenda, right? He gives a story where he says goes to an oracle and he asks the oracle, who is the wisest person? And the oracle says that it's you, Socrates. And he says, no way, that can't be the case. And so he sets out on a path to find someone who is wiser than himself, right? And as it turns out, he can't really find someone who's wiser than himself. So you might think it's a little bit of false humility there, and there's a lot of that through this. But nonetheless, I mean, he claims that he doesn't have an agenda here, and he claims that there's only one thing that really makes him wiser than the other people, which is that he knows that he doesn't know anything, right? He claims that, for example, the poets think they know what beauty is, but when you ask them to say what it is, they can't say it, right? So they don't really know what beauty is. And what separates him from the poets is that he doesn't think that he knows what beauty is, right? Same thing with judges, right? The judges think they know what justice is, but they don't really know it. And what makes him wiser than the judges is just that he admits, he's honest with himself about the fact that he doesn't know what justice is, right? So that's the first charge. The second charge, corrupting the youth, is he has a very interesting argument about this, which he basically says, look, if I'm corrupting the youth, then I'm making the youth liable to harm others, right? And if the youth are going to harm others, I'm amongst the other people, right? They're liable to harm me, right? But I wouldn't do something that put myself in harm's way. And so I must not be corrupting the youth, or I'm doing it unintentionally, right? And he says, if I'm doing it on purpose, I can't do it on purpose. I wouldn't do it on purpose. But if I'm doing it unintentionally, then you shouldn't be bringing me up on criminal charges for it, right? Underlying this is a kind of very strong ethical claim, which is the idea that someone would not do something that puts them in harm's way. This is a big deal for Plato. He really thinks that people don't intentionally do things that they think are bad for them, right? That's not to say that people don't do things that are bad for them. They just do so based on ignorance of what is genuinely in their own best interest, right? And so this is a big deal. But this is kind of what I mean. The overview of what Socrates is after here is that corrupting the youth would be kind of putting himself in a bad position, and he's not going to do that, right? And there's a lot to that, right? But that's his defense for that second claim. And then the third claim about not believing in the gods, well, he kind of goes back to the oracle story, and he talks about how they admit, the people who are charging him admit that he believes in divinities, right? He's talking to oracles. He talks about the gods, and he says, well, how can I believe in divine things and not believe in the gods, right? It doesn't make sense. You obviously admit that I'm kind of, I have this kind of spiritual orientation, so I have to believe in kind of spiritual beings, right? Now, this all kind of culminates in the trial, and as it turns out that they vote against him, and they give him the choice of exile or death, and he chooses death because he says if he's in exile, he'll just continue to do what he does and go to some other town and question all them, and they'll come to the same conclusion. So he doesn't want to stop philosophizing, right? And he ends up with this quote that's very famous, which is that the unexamined life is not worth living, right? And there's lots of ways to interpret this, right? But I think in a general way, you can read Socrates as making this claim that philosophy is so important to him. It's more important to kind of find the truth, to examine his life, to question things than it is to preserve his own life, right? That's a very kind of strong version, but you might have a kind of a weaker version of this that, we have, consciousness and self-consciousness, and so we have some kind of obligation to use it, right? And to not examine one's own life is kind of a waste in some way, right? It's not quite as strong as what Socrates is up to. But you can also recognize, I think, on the other end of this, some people say ignorance is bliss, right? That it's better not to know, and sometimes it's appropriate to put your head in the sand, right? And one might also step back from this and recognize that Socrates is being put to death, and he's obviously things aren't working out so well for him, right? So you might think, philosophy is not that great of a pursuit, right? And actually, that's very much reflected in our society, right? A lot of people aren't very big on philosophy, and a lot of people think it's a waste of time, and that we should do things that are more practical and all this kind of stuff. So I just is putting that out there. What is the importance of philosophy, and what's the role of that, right? That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we will talk soon.